Council resolution calling on all states to observe international law, and so on. All of this was with the acquiescence or the silence of the major media. And none of this has ever suggested that the United States is anything else but the world's leading peace-loving state. Now, in August 1987, much to the discomfiture of Washington, the Central American presidents agreed to a peace settlement, the Esquipulas II Accord. The U.S. at once dedicated every effort to undermining it. The accord specified one indispensable element for peace in the region, namely ending any form of aid to indigenous guerrillas or to the Contras. The U.S. response was to escalate, to step up the number of illegal supply flights to the Contras. They had already reached the phenomenal level of about one a day in an effort to keep the proxy forces in the field. In the following months, they were virtually tripled. That was part of an effort to increase the level of violence, and it was successful. That was shown by terrorist attacks on civilian targets, which increased, as was hoped, with many casualties. The media cooperated by suppressing the whole story. That's pretty remarkable because, I mean, there's an occasional, I did a full media study on this. You find a couple of sentences scattered around, basically suppressed. New York Times, totally suppressed. It's pretty remarkable because that was by far the most important thing that happened right after the Esquipulas II Accords. It essentially wiped them out. Washington also rejected another central part of the accords. They were based on the concept of symmetry. Various things had to happen simultaneously in all the countries. That was unacceptable to the United States for an obvious reason. It meant that the U.S. client states would have to adhere to the conditions on democracy and human rights, and that's an obvious impossibility without destroying the whole structure and starting all over again. Also unacceptable to the United States was international monitoring. It's a threat to the U.S. intent to undermine the accords and to the constant violations of the U.S. terror states. Well, by January 1988, U.S. pressure had succeeded in entirely dismantling the accord. Nothing left of it. It eliminated the international monitors, narrowed the application of the accords to Nicaragua alone. And the media cooperated fully. Another remarkable contribution to terror and repression in the service of power. Again, I've documented that in detail elsewhere. In March 1988, a ceasefire was reached in Nicaragua. The consequences are interesting. The agreement of this was virtually not reported. Let me tell you the facts. You can check and find out for yourself. The agreement in March 1988 designated the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Secretary General Suarez, as the official in charge of monitoring the agreement. The agreement stipulated that aid to the Contras must be limited to neutral carriers delivered in ceasefire zones within Nicaragua and in accordance with the Esquipulas II agreements. If you check, you'll discover that Congress at once voted to violate every one of these conditions while declaring that it was adhering to the terms of the accords. I'll give you details later if you like. Secretary General Suarez, who was in charge of monitoring the agreement, wrote an official letter to Secretary of State George Shultz in which he condemned these violations of the ceasefire agreements. Homework problem, try to find a reference to that in the U.S. press. The media, in fact, adhered to the Washington version that the only problem was whether the treacherous Sandinistas would agree to permit humanitarian aid to reach the beleaguered and suffering resistance fighters. Incidentally, the fact that the aid does not qualify as humanitarian by any standards whatsoever was determined by the World Court in the ignored ruling to the usual media silence. There is no such thing by legal standards as humanitarian aid to the Contras. In February 1989, well, to the present now, the Central American presidents reached another agreement. By now, they were largely observing U.S. demands. Nicaragua, the accords were limited to Nicaragua, and the Nicaraguan request for international monitoring was rejected. But the obedience of the presidents was insufficient. The point is that the agreement called for dismantling the Contras, and it stipulated that any aid to them must conform to the Esquipulas II Accords, which barred aid of any form, military, logistical, financial, propagandistic. There was one exception. Aid could go for the purpose of demobilization, repatriation, or relocation. That's the one exception. Well, congressional doves agreed at once to violate these terms by providing $4.5 million a month to maintain the Contras as a military force in Honduras as a threat against Nicaragua. And you'll notice that that is in direct violation of the terms of the accord. Well, the media responded by lauding the historic agreement, quoting, committing the administration and Congress to aid for the Nicaraguan rebels and support for the Central American peace efforts, which incidentally reject that aid as inconsistent with them. That's Bernard Weinraub in the New York Times. And a New York Times editorial added, and solemnly intoned, that U.S. goals are now consistent with the regional pact, which they had just explicitly violated. Now, in this case, the media advanced beyond the usual falsification in the service of power to toleration of direct self-contradiction, actually in one sentence. Pretty, again, impressive performance. Well, without going on, we find the same pattern wherever we turn. The task of responsible insiders is to obey and to do their work. The torment of the tortured and suffering victims elsewhere is not their concern. That's the concern only of emotional extremists who don't comprehend the norms of respectable society. We need not dwell on the historical precedents to all of this, which are not hard to find if we have the honesty to look for them.
We'd like to open up the floor now for question and answers. We have two mics, one in this aisle and one in this aisle, so if you'll just line up. If we can impose upon you to keep your questions and comments to 1 minute, please. Thank you.
We'll start there and go to...
Okay. What is your thinking now on the Khmer Rouge regime of the 1970s and the U.S.'s prior involvement? And how has your thinking changed on the subject from your views of the 70s? Did your experience in investigating the Cambodian situation in the 70s subsequently result in any change in your methodology of political analysis?
Well, the conclusions that we reached, this is my colleague and I, Edward Herman, who published an analysis of the media coverage of the Khmer Rouge in 1979. This was a very carefully done analysis. Nobody's ever found the slightest error in it. There's a reason for that. Before we published it, and it was obviously a sensitive issue, we sent it around to most of the authentic Cambodia scholars in the world, and they had checked it and validated it and so on. And in fact, as far as I know, it was completely accurate. That's also the conclusion of the scholarly literature. So if you look at the major scholarly work on Cambodia by Michael Vickery, who's the major, one of the 2 or 3 serious Cambodia scholars, he refers to that fact. He notes that in the light of the vast amount of information that's come out since, he says there's virtually nothing that requires changing in this analysis. There's an interesting reaction to that. We didn't just discuss the Khmer Rouge. We discussed something else. And it's very interesting, the reactions. Let me bring it up. This was part of our effort to test the propaganda model. It was in a 2-volume work which was concerned with U.S. policy and propaganda. And in the test of the propaganda model, we tried to find paired examples, cases where history does a controlled experiment, sort of. So we did a detailed investigation of 2 huge atrocities in the late 70s, the 2 major ones, in fact. One was the Khmer Rouge massacres, and the other was the U.S.-backed Indonesian massacres in Timor. And the 2, it's a good choice. The 2 are rather comparable. I mean, at the point where the furor over the Khmer Rouge peaked in the United States, it was early 1977. At that point, the killings in Timor started about the same time. By the time furor peaked in the United States, probably more people had been killed in Timor than in Cambodia, or at least it was roughly equivalent. And of course, relative to the population, it was vastly more in Timor. It's probably, in fact, the worst slaughter since the Holocaust. And we compared those two cases, and we found just a dramatic proof of the propaganda model. In the case of Cambodia, there was huge furor, vast exaggeration, fabrication of evidence, repetition of lies after they were conceded to be lies, suppression of evidence. For example, the reports of there was one knowledgeable source at the time, State Department intelligence, and in retrospect their reports looked pretty good. That was suppressed. I mean, we reported it, but it was virtually suppressed because it was telling the wrong story. That was one story. In the case of Timor, the thing was quite different. That was a U.S.-backed invasion. Carter administration provided 90% of the arms. The United States blocked anything at the UN to stop the aggression. The Carter administration offered new arms, contrary to what it reported to Congress right after Indonesia.